Between glass towers that pierce the sky and quiet streets where hope whispers softly, two worlds existed in perfect separation. One bathed in golden abundance, the other wrapped in the tender struggle of survival. They were universes apart, divided by more than distance, more than circumstance. And yet, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, when the city lights began their nightly dance and shadows grew long across marble floors, something extraordinary happened. A single message, born from desperation and courage, traveled across the invisible line that separates those who have everything from those who have almost nothing. It was a message so simple, so raw, so achingly human, that it would shatter the carefully constructed walls of a man who had forgotten how to feel and illuminate the path toward something neither sender nor receiver could have imagined. A connection that would rewrite the meaning of wealth, of purpose, of love itself. The message arrived without ceremony, without warning. Just words on a screen, glowing softly in the dim light of an executive office where decisions worth millions were made daily. My son is without milk. I have nowhere left to turn. 12 words. 12 small flames that would ignite something dormant, something beautiful, something that had been waiting in the darkness for permission to breathe. There was no manipulation in those words, no elaborate story designed to pull at heartstrings. Just truth, stripped bare and vulnerable, offered up like a prayer to a stranger who lived in a world where such problems seemed impossibly distant. The woman who sent it had hesitated for hours, her fingers hovering over the send button, shame and necessity wrestling in her chest, until necessity won. Not for herself, but for the child sleeping restlessly in the next room, his tiny stomach empty, his mother's heart breaking. In his corner office on the 47th floor, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city like a painting of power and success, Alexander Hayes paused. His finger had been scrolling mindlessly through messages, the way one does at the end of a long day when exhaustion makes everything blur together. But this one stopped him cold. He read it once, twice, 3 times, each reading peeling back another layer of the armor he wore so naturally he'd forgotten it was there. Around him, the world continued its relentless spin. His assistant's voice filtered through the intercom. His phone buzzed with notifications from investors and board members. The skyline glittered with the promise of another flawless evening in a flawless life. But Alexander couldn't move. Something about those 12 words had reached through the screen and touched a place he thought had calcified years ago. A place that remembered what it meant to be hungry, to be helpless, to watch someone you love suffer while the world looked away. Why this message? Why, among the thousands of requests that flooded his inbox daily, did this one feel like a hand reaching out specifically for him, as if the universe itself had whispered his name and said, "Pay attention. This matters." Alexander Hayes had built an empire on precision, on the careful construction of systems that ran like clockwork, flawless and unfeeling. His mornings began at 5:30, with black coffee and financial reports. His afternoons filled with meetings where he spoke in numbers and strategies. His evenings spent alone in spaces so immaculately designed they felt more like museums than homes. He was 42 years old and controlled more wealth than most people could imagine in a lifetime. Yet somewhere along the climb to the top, he had traded warmth for efficiency, connection for control. His suits were tailored to perfection, his hair always precisely styled, his expressions carefully neutral. A man who had learned that vulnerability was a liability and emotions were distractions from the business of winning. People called him brilliant, visionary, untouchable. What they didn't see was the way he sometimes stood at his window late at night, looking down at the city below, feeling the weight of all that success pressing against his chest like a stone, wondering when exactly he had stopped recognizing himself in the mirror. The woman who had sent that message lived in a different world entirely, one measured not in quarterly profits, but in daily survival, in the mathematics of stretching a single dollar across impossible distances. Emma Chen was 28 years old with eyes that still held light despite everything trying to dim them. A single mother whose life had unraveled in the space of 6 months. A layoff that came without warning. Savings that evaporated faster than morning dew, and then the final indignity of eviction notices and empty cupboards. But there was something unbreakable in her. A quiet strength that showed itself in the way she held her head high even when walking through the grocery store, putting items back on shelves she couldn't afford. She had been a graphic designer once, talented and full of dreams. Her portfolio filled with colors and hope, and the kind of creative fire that makes people stop and stare. Now she spent her days applying for jobs that never called back. Her nights soothing a 3-year-old boy named Ethan, who didn't understand why dinner was sometimes just crackers, why his mother's smile had grown tired around the edges, why their new apartment was so much smaller and darker than the last one. While Alexander lived surrounded by abundance so complete it had become invisible. Restaurants where a single meal cost more than some families spent on groceries in a month, cars that purred like contented cats, art that hung on walls because it was expected rather than loved. Emma lived counting coins, calculating which bill could wait another week, stretching a single can of soup into 2 meals. The contrast was stark, almost cruel in its completeness. He moved through spaces where people deferred to him, where his word carried the weight of law, where comfort was assumed and luxury was baseline. She moved through a world that had grown cold and indifferent, where asking for help felt like stripping away the last shred of dignity, where every day was a tightrope walk between holding on and letting go. And yet, despite the miles between their realities, despite the vast ocean of circumstance that separated their lives, something was about to bridge that gap. Something delicate and powerful. Something that would prove that distance is sometimes just an illusion, that 2 hearts can find each other across any divide if they're brave enough to reach. What would be born from this unlikely meeting wasn't just transformation, though transformation would come. It wasn't just healing, though healing would flow like water over parched ground. It was something more fundamental, more luminous. The kind of beginning that arrives softly, like dawn, breaking over a landscape that has known only darkness, like the first green shoots pushing through winter earth, like a promise whispered in a language older than words. 2 people, 2 worlds, one message that would change everything. And in that space between desperation and abundance, between reaching out and reaching back, something beautiful was already beginning to bloom. Tender as morning light, inevitable as the turning of seasons, real as the beating of 2 hearts that didn't yet know they were searching for each other. The email had arrived at 6:47 p.m., slipping into Alexander's inbox between a merger proposal and a dinner invitation he would decline. He had been preparing to leave the office, his jacket already draped over one arm, his mind already halfway to the penthouse apartment where silence waited like a faithful companion. But something made him pause, made him set the jacket down and return to his desk, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name. The subject line was simple, almost too simple. A mother's plea. No clever marketing language, no professional polish, just those 3 words that cut through the noise of 1,000 other messages demanding his attention. When he opened it, the words inside were even simpler, stripped of everything except raw need and quiet courage. My son is without milk. I have nowhere left to turn. And beneath that, just a name, Emma Chen. No elaborate backstory, no list of credentials or reasons why she deserved help. Just the truth, offered up like a candle flame in the darkness, small and trembling and impossibly brave. Alexander read it again, his eyes tracing each word as if searching for some hidden meaning, some explanation for why this particular message had stopped him in his tracks when hundreds of others passed through his consciousness daily without leaving a mark. There was something about the simplicity of it, the absence of manipulation or performance, that felt like a hand reaching through time and touching something buried deep in his chest. He remembered, suddenly and vividly, what it felt like to be 8 years old and hungry, sitting at a kitchen table in a cramped apartment that smelled of mildew and disappointment, watching his mother count change with shaking hands, her face tight with the kind of worry that makes people age overnight. He remembered the weight of her shame, the way she had tried to hide their struggles from him even as he lay awake at night listening to her cry in the next room. That was decades ago, before the scholarships and the business degree, before he had clawed his way out of poverty and into a world where hunger was just an abstract concept, where money moved in invisible streams and security was assumed. He had worked so hard to leave that world behind, to build walls so high that the past could never reach him again. And yet, here it was, breaking through in 12 simple words from a stranger who had no idea she was asking help from someone who understood her desperation more intimately than she could imagine. A strange sensation moved through him, something uncomfortable and electric, like blood returning to a limb that had fallen asleep. His first instinct was to dismiss it, to categorize this as just another charitable case that his assistant could handle, another donation that would be processed and forgotten. But something stopped him from closing the email, from moving on to the next task. Instead, he found himself staring at her name, wondering about the woman behind those words, wondering what kind of strength it took to reach out like this, to strip away pride and ask a stranger for help. There was a purity in her honesty that felt almost sacred, a vulnerability that demanded to be met with equal honesty rather than cold efficiency. Alexander Hayes, who made million-dollar decisions without hesitation, who negotiated with Fortune 500 CEOs without breaking a sweat, found himself paralyzed by a simple plea from a woman he had never met. And in that paralysis, in that moment of unexpected hesitation, something cracked open inside him. Not breaking, but opening. Like a door that had been locked for so long everyone had forgotten there was a room beyond it. He didn't know it yet, couldn't have articulated it if asked. But sitting there in his perfect office with the city lights beginning to glow like scattered stars below, Alexander Hayes had just taken the first step toward remembering what it meant to be human, to be connected, to feel something deeper than the satisfaction of another successful deal. And that feeling, uncomfortable as it was, felt strangely like coming home. Emma's story had not begun with desperation, though that was where it had led her. 6 months ago, she had been a different woman. Not happier, perhaps, but steadier, more certain of her place in the world. She had worked at a small but thriving design agency, the kind of place where creativity flowed freely, and Friday afternoons meant brainstorming sessions that turned into laughter and collaboration. Her desk had been covered with sketches and color swatches, her computer filled with projects that made her heart sing, her co-workers the kind of people who remembered birthdays and brought coffee without being asked. She had been good at what she did, exceptional even, her designs winning praise from clients and earning quiet nods of approval from her boss. And more importantly, she had been stable. Not wealthy, never wealthy, but comfortable enough to pay rent on time, to buy groceries without anxiety, to occasionally treat Ethan to ice cream on Saturday afternoons while they walked through the park, his small hand warm in hers, his laughter bright as bells. Life hadn't been perfect, but it had been hers, built piece by careful piece after Ethan's father had left when she was 5 months pregnant, disappearing like smoke and leaving her to build a world for two on a foundation meant for one. Then came the email that changed everything, delivered on a Tuesday morning with the kind of corporate coldness that makes humanity feel like an inconvenience. Due to restructuring and budget constraints, we regret to inform you. The words had blurred together as she read them, sitting at her desk while around her the office continued its normal rhythm, people typing and talking and drinking coffee as if the ground beneath her feet hadn't just opened up. They had given her 2 weeks, a severance package that sounded generous until she calculated how quickly it would disappear, and reassurances about references that felt hollow in the face of an oversaturated job market where hundreds of qualified designers competed for every opening. She had walked out that day carrying a cardboard box filled with personal items, photos of Ethan, a coffee mug he had painted for her at daycare, sketches she had been particularly proud of, and tried to smile when her former co-workers offered sympathetic hugs and promises to stay in touch. But inside, terror was already taking root, growing like frost across glass, because she understood something they didn't. For a single mother with no family support, no safety net, no backup plan, losing a job wasn't just an inconvenience or a temporary setback. It was a cliff edge, and she had just been pushed over it. The weeks that followed became a blur of applications sent into the void, interviews that went nowhere, savings draining away like water through cupped hands no matter how carefully she tried to hold on. Emma had always been resourceful, had always found ways to make things work, but poverty has a way of shrinking options until there's nothing left but impossible choices. Should she pay rent or buy groceries? Should she keep Ethan in daycare so she could job hunt, or pull him out and lose those precious hours to search? Should she skip meals so he could eat, pretend she wasn't hungry when he asked why she only had coffee for dinner? The mathematics of survival became her constant companion, numbers cycling through her mind at all hours, the cost of diapers, the price of milk, the looming rent deadline that approached like a storm on the horizon. She sold everything she could, her laptop, her jewelry, the nice camera she had saved for years to buy, each sale feeling like cutting away a piece of herself, a piece of the person she used to be. And still, it wasn't enough. The eviction notice came on a rainy Thursday, slipped under her door like a prophecy of everything she had been trying to prevent, and she had stood there in the hallway, holding it with shaking hands, while Ethan played with blocks in the living room, innocent and oblivious to the fact that their world was crumbling. The new apartment was smaller, darker, located in a neighborhood where sirens sang through the night, and the walls were so thin she could hear her neighbors' arguments bleeding through like ghosts. But it was what she could afford, barely, precariously, by the grace of a landlord who took pity on her enough to accept a payment plan. She had tried to make it feel like home for Ethan's sake, hanging his artwork on the walls, arranging his toys in the corner where afternoon light sometimes filtered through the single window, reading him stories at night, and pretending everything was an adventure, a temporary situation that would improve soon. But 3-year-olds are more perceptive than we give them credit for. And she saw the confusion in his eyes when dinner became smaller, when she told him they couldn't go to the park anymore because she needed to save bus fare, when he asked for juice, and she gave him water instead, her heart breaking at the look of quiet acceptance on his face. The worst moment came on a Tuesday evening, when she opened the refrigerator to make his bottle and found it empty. The last of the milk gone. No money until her unemployment check came in 3 days. No options left, except the one she had been avoiding with every fiber of her being, asking for help. Emma had spent an entire day composing that email, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, shame and necessity fighting a war in her chest. She had found Alexander Hayes' contact information through a news article about his company's charitable foundation, one of dozens of desperate attempts to find someone, anyone, who might listen. She had deleted the message 5 times, rewritten it 7, each version either too detailed or too vague, too emotional or too cold. In the end, she had stripped it down to the bare truth, the simple statement of her situation without embellishment or apology. My son is without milk. I have nowhere left to turn. Pressing send had felt like stepping off a cliff, like exposing her most vulnerable self to a stranger who had no reason to care, who probably received hundreds of similar requests and ignored them all. But as she looked at Ethan sleeping in his small bed, his face peaceful and trusting, still believing that his mother could fix anything, she knew she had no choice. Sometimes love means swallowing pride, means reaching out even when rejection seems inevitable, means being brave enough to ask for help, not because you're weak, but because someone you love needs you to be stronger than your fear. And so she had sent it, this small prayer into the void, and then she had waited, hoping against hope that somewhere in that distant world of wealth and power, someone might still remember what it felt like to be human. Alexander sat motionless at his desk long after the office had emptied, the building settling into its nighttime silence, the cleaning crew's distant movements the only sound besides the quiet hum of his computer. The email remained open on his screen, those 12 words glowing in the dim light like an accusation, like a mirror reflecting something he had spent years trying to forget. His rational mind, The part of him that had built an empire on calculated decisions and strategic thinking immediately began constructing walls around the feeling that had cracked open in his chest. This was a common situation. His inner voice argued coolly, a tale repeated thousands of times across the city every day. Single mothers struggling, children going hungry, desperation driving people to reach out to strangers. His company had charitable protocols for situations like this, systems designed specifically so he wouldn't have to engage personally with every sob story that crossed his path. He could forward it to his assistant, ask her to process a donation through the proper channels, maybe arrange for a grocery delivery service to send supplies. That would be the professional response, the appropriate response, the kind of measured generosity that kept healthy boundaries between his world and the messy complications of other people's suffering. But even as he tried to rationalize it away, to reduce Emma Chen's plea to just another item on a to-do list, something inside him resisted. He found himself reading the email again, searching between the lines for details she hadn't provided, wondering about the woman who had written it. What kind of person strips away all pretense and asks for help with such naked honesty? What circumstances had driven her to this point? And how long had she fought before admitting she couldn't do it alone? The questions multiplied, uninvited and insistent, refusing to be dismissed with his usual efficiency. Alexander realized with growing discomfort that he wanted to know her story, wanted to understand how someone ends up sending desperate messages to strangers at the end of the day, when all other options have evaporated. It wasn't just curiosity, though curiosity was part of it. It was something deeper, something that felt uncomfortably like recognition, as if her desperation was speaking directly to a part of him he had tried to bury beneath years of success and carefully maintain distance from anything that might make him feel too much. The conflict inside him intensified as the minutes ticked by, logic warring with emotion in a way he hadn't experienced in years. On one side stood every principle he had built his life around, the importance of boundaries, the danger of getting personally involved, the reality that he couldn't save everyone no matter how much money he had, the simple fact that emotional decisions were usually poor decisions. He had learned through hard experience to keep his distance from suffering, to help through systems and structures that insulated him from the raw humanity of need. Getting personally involved meant opening doors he had carefully sealed, meant allowing himself to feel things that would interfere with the clinical clarity required to run a company, to make decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions in revenue. On the other side stood something more primal, more fundamental, a voice that sounded suspiciously like his 8-year-old self, the boy who had understood hunger and helplessness, who had watched his mother's dignity crumble under the weight of poverty, who had promised himself that someday he would be strong enough to make sure no one else had to feel that way. That voice was asking him a question he couldn't answer. What's the point of all this success if it walls you off from the very humanity that made you fight for it in the first place? Alexander stood abruptly, pacing to the window where the city sprawled below like a circuit board of light and shadow. Thousands of lives unfolding in apartments and houses and street corners, each one a complete universe of hope and struggle invisible from this height. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, feeling the separation between his climate-controlled sanctuary and the world beyond, and made a decision that surprised him even as he reached for his phone. He wouldn't delegate this. He wouldn't process it through channels or reduce it to a transaction. He would verify her situation himself, would look into her circumstances with his own eyes, rather than through the filtered lens of reports and summaries. It was unusual, unprofessional even, the kind of personal involvement he had trained himself away from. But something about this felt different, felt important in a way he couldn't articulate, but couldn't ignore. Maybe it was the memory of his mother's tears, or maybe it was something about Emma's honesty that demanded an equally honest response, or maybe, in some part of himself he barely recognized anymore, he was simply tired of being untouchable, tired of the loneliness that came with perfection, tired of going through the motions of a life that felt increasingly hollow, despite its material abundance. Whatever the reason, he found himself wanting to meet this woman, to look into the eyes of someone brave enough to ask for help and see what kind of person emerged from that vulnerability. And in that wanting, something shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, but like the first crack in ice before the spring thaw, a promise of something warmer waiting beneath the frozen surface. The next morning arrived wrapped in autumn mist, the kind of soft gray light that makes the city feel suspended between dreams and waking. Alexander had barely slept, his mind turning over the decision he'd made, questioning it, and then recommitting to it, in cycles that stretched through the dark hours. By 7 a.m., he was already in his office, bypassing his usual routine of reports and market analysis to make a phone call that felt both necessary and strangely intrusive. Marcus Chen, no relation to Emma, despite the shared surname, ran a small but reputable investigation firm that Alexander's company occasionally used for background checks and due diligence. "I need you to verify something for me," Alexander said, his voice carefully neutral, even as his heart beat faster than the situation warranted. "A woman named Emma Chen. She's reached out for help, and I want to make sure the situation is legitimate before proceeding." He provided the limited information he had, then added something unexpected even to himself. "And Marcus, handle this with care. If her situation is real, I don't want her feeling surveilled or violated. Just confirm what she's told me is true." Marcus called back within 4 hours, his voice carrying a weight that confirmed Alexander's instincts before a single word was spoken. "It's legitimate," he said simply. "More than legitimate. It's worse than she described." The report that followed painted a picture so achingly real that Alexander found himself gripping the phone tighter, his jaw clenched against the surge of emotion threatening to break through his carefully maintained composure. Emma Chen was indeed a single mother, 28 years old, formerly employed as a graphic designer until the layoffs 6 months prior. She had applied for over 200 positions since then, each application carefully crafted, each rejection another small death of hope. Her unemployment benefits were set to run out in 3 weeks. The apartment she lived in now was a significant downgrade from her previous residence, located in a neighborhood with one of the highest crime rates in the city, the rent consuming 70% of her remaining income. Marcus's team had verified her employment history, her education, a degree in design from a state university, earned while working 2 jobs, and her complete absence of family support. Her parents had passed away in a car accident when she was 19, leaving her truly alone in the world, except for her son. But it was the smaller details that hit Alexander hardest, the intimate glimpses into a life lived on the knife's edge of survival. The investigator's report noted that Emma had sold her laptop 3 weeks ago, a designer without her primary tool, desperate enough to sacrifice her ability to work for immediate cash. Her electricity had been shut off twice in the past month, restored only after she negotiated payment plans she could barely afford. The local food bank had her listed as a regular visitor, always polite, always grateful, always taking only the bare minimum despite being told she could take more. One of her neighbors, interviewed discreetly, had mentioned seeing her in the hallway late at night, sitting on the floor outside her apartment door, just sitting there with her head in her hands, probably trying to compose herself before going back inside to face her son with a smile. Another neighbor reported that Emma often skipped meals, claiming she wasn't hungry when Ethan asked why she wasn't eating. Her sacrifice so quiet and constant, it had become invisible even to herself. And then there was the detail that made Alexander's chest tighten almost painfully. Multiple witnesses confirmed that despite everything, despite the grinding poverty and constant stress, Emma was an attentive, loving mother who read to her son every night, who sang to him in the mornings, who somehow managed to make him feel safe and cherished, even as their world crumbled around them. The photographs in the report, taken from public spaces, nothing invasive or inappropriate, showed a woman who looked simultaneously stronger and more fragile than Alexander had imagined. Emma Chen had dark hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, delicate features that would have been beautiful if exhaustion hadn't etched itself into the shadows under her eyes, and a posture that spoke of someone carrying weight far beyond what should rest on such slender shoulders. But there was something else in her expression, visible even in the grainy surveillance photos. A determination, a quiet refusal to break despite everything trying to break her. She wasn't defeated, Alexander realized with something approaching awe. She was bent, certainly, tested beyond what seemed endurable, but there was a light in her eyes that poverty hadn't managed to extinguish. A dignity in the way she held herself that made his breath catch unexpectedly. In one image, she was crouched down talking to Ethan outside the food bank, her hand cupped gently against his cheek, and the tenderness in that gesture, the pure love visible in the curve of her body toward her child, struck something deep in Alexander's chest that he hadn't known was still capable of feeling. He spent the rest of the day unable to focus on anything else, the report sitting on his desk like a living thing demanding attention. Board meetings came and went with him barely present, his mind replaying the details, constructing a three-dimensional understanding of Emma's life from the fragments Marcus had gathered. This wasn't abstract anymore, wasn't a simple charitable case that could be resolved with a donation and forgotten. This was a real person, fighting with everything she had, demonstrating the kind of strength that had nothing to do with power or wealth, and everything to do with the simple, profound courage of continuing to show up, to try, to love, even when the world seemed determined to crush that love beneath the weight of impossible circumstances. Alexander found himself thinking about resilience, about what it truly meant to be strong, and realizing with uncomfortable clarity that he had confused comfort with strength for far too long. That insulating himself from difficulty had made him weaker, not stronger, had cost him something essential about what it meant to be fully human. And as the day faded into evening and the city lights began their nightly performance beyond his window, he made another decision, one that would require more than money, more than professional distance, more than the careful boundaries he had maintained for decades. He would go to her himself. He would look into the eyes of this woman who had inadvertently reminded him of everything he'd tried to forget, and he would find a way to help that honored her dignity rather than diminishing it. Not because it was good business, not because it served some strategic purpose, but because something in her story had awakened something in him that refused to go back to sleep. A recognition of shared humanity, a memory of vulnerability, and perhaps, though he barely dared acknowledge it, the first stirring of something that felt dangerously close to connection. Topico 3. 5. O incontro. Alexander had never been to this part of the city, not in all his years of living here, not in all his careful navigation of routes between office and home, and the select few places where people of his world gathered. The drive took him through neighborhoods that grew progressively more worn, buildings that leaned into each other like tired soldiers, streets where children played between parked cars and laundry hung from fire escapes like flags of stubborn survival. His driver had given him a concerned look when he'd provided the address, a silent question about whether Mr. Hayes was certain he wanted to go there personally. But Alexander had simply nodded, his jaw set with a determination that surprised even himself. He had left the car 3 blocks away, choosing to walk the final distance because arriving in a town car with a driver felt like an insult, like showing up to someone's struggle in a costume of wealth that would only emphasize the distance between their worlds. So he walked, his expensive shoes clicking against cracked sidewalks, his tailored coat drawing curious glances from people sitting on stoops, and felt more exposed, more uncertain than he had in any boardroom negotiation. Emma's building was a 5-story walk-up with peeling paint and a front door that didn't quite close properly, the kind of place that wore its hardship openly, without pretense or apology. Alexander climbed the stairs slowly, counting floors, his heart beating harder with each step, though he couldn't have said whether it was from exertion or from something else entirely, something that felt uncomfortably like nervousness. He had faced down corporate raiders and hostile takeovers without breaking a sweat, but standing outside apartment 4C with his hand raised to knock, he found himself hesitating, suddenly aware of how strange this was, how far outside his normal patterns of behavior. What was he doing here? What did he think would happen? The questions multiplied, but before he could talk himself out of it, before rationality could reassert control, he knocked. 3 soft raps that sounded too loud in the quiet hallway, too final, too much like a commitment he couldn't take back. The door opened slowly, cautiously, the chain lock still engaged. And then Alexander found himself looking into the face of the woman whose story had occupied his thoughts for the past 24 hours. Emma Chen was smaller than he'd expected, more delicate, with those same dark eyes from the photographs, but somehow more luminous in person, more alive with the kind of intelligence and wariness that comes from navigating a world that hasn't been kind. She stared at him for a long moment, confusion flickering across her features, her hand still gripping the door, as if it were the only solid thing in a suddenly unstable universe. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but steady, carrying an undertone of protective instinct. A mother's voice, ready to close the door if this stranger posed any threat. Alexander realized with a start that she had no idea who he was, that his name meant nothing to her outside of an email address, that he had inserted himself into her life without warning, and now stood on her doorstep like some kind of benevolent intruder. "Emma Chen?" he said, his own voice coming out rougher than intended, less polished than the carefully modulated tone he used in business settings. "My name is Alexander Hayes. You sent me a message yesterday about your son needing milk." He watched recognition dawn slowly across her face, watched it transform from confusion to disbelief, to something that looked painfully like shame, her cheeks flushing with color as she realized that this man, this obviously wealthy stranger in his expensive coat and polished shoes, had tracked her down in person. Her hand flew to her hair, an unconscious gesture of self-consciousness, and Alexander saw her become suddenly, acutely aware of her faded jeans and worn sweater, of the shabby hallway behind her, of all the visible markers of the poverty she had tried to hide behind the relative anonymity of an email. I'm sorry," she stammered, and Alexander felt something twist in his chest at the apology, at the way she was already trying to make herself smaller, less burdensome. "I didn't expect... I wasn't asking for you to come here. I just thought maybe... May I come in?" Alexander interrupted gently, not wanting to watch her spiral into embarrassment, not wanting this conversation to happen in a hallway where curious neighbors might overhear. Emma hesitated, her internal debate visible in the way her eyes darted from him to the space behind her, clearly mortified at the thought of this polished stranger seeing her cramped apartment, her humble circumstances laid bare. But then something shifted in her expression, a kind of resigned dignity, a decision to face this moment with whatever grace she could muster. And she nodded, sliding the chain free and opening the door wider. "It's not much," she said quietly as he stepped inside, an unnecessary apology for a space that was actually meticulously maintained despite its size and age, clean in a way that spoke of someone who took pride in what little they had, who refused to let poverty equal disorder. The apartment was barely larger than Alexander's walk-in closet, a single room that served as living room and bedroom with a tiny kitchenette along one wall and a closed door that presumably led to a bathroom. But what struck him immediately wasn't the size or the worn furniture or the obvious markers of financial struggle. It was the warmth, the way Emma had tried to create a home here. The child's drawings taped to the walls, the books stacked neatly on a makeshift shelf, the small touches that spoke of love and care and determination to give her son a childhood that felt secure, even when security was an illusion. From the corner of the room, a small boy looked up from where he'd been playing with a modest collection of toy cars, his eyes wide with the unfiltered curiosity of a 3-year-old confronting something new and unexpected. Ethan Chen had his mother's dark hair and delicate features, but his eyes were lighter, amber-colored and bright, with an innocence that made Alexander's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Mama," the boy said, his voice carrying a question, and Emma immediately crossed to him, kneeling down to his level with a reassuring smile that transformed her face, erasing years of worry and replacing them with a tenderness so pure it was almost painful to witness. "It's okay, baby," she murmured, smoothing his hair with a gesture so instinctive, so full of protective love that Alexander had to look away for a moment, overwhelmed by the intimacy of it, by the sudden awareness that he was intruding on something precious and private. "This is Mr. Hayes. He's here to help us." The way she said it, with a mixture of hope and disbelief and gratitude that hadn't yet decided if it was safe to fully emerge, made Alexander understand the weight of what his presence meant to her, the lifeline he represented whether he lived up to it or not. Emma stood slowly, turning back to face him with a composure that was clearly costing her effort to maintain. Her hands clasped in front of her in a gesture that managed to be both defensive and dignified. "I'm sorry about the message," she said again, and Alexander wanted to tell her to stop apologizing, that she had nothing to be sorry for, that her courage in reaching out was something to be honored rather than diminished. "I was desperate, and I found your company's information online, and I just thought, I don't know what I thought, that maybe someone would read it and care, even for a moment." Her voice wavered slightly on the last words, the vulnerability she was trying to contain leaking through despite her best efforts. "I've applied for hundreds of jobs. I've gone to food banks and asked for help from every resource I could find. But nothing has been enough, and when Ethan needed milk and I had nothing to give him, I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't stand being the mother who can't provide the most basic things." Tears were gathering in her eyes now, despite her obvious determination not to cry, her hands gripping each other tighter, as if that physical pressure could hold back the emotional flood threatening to break through. Alexander found himself moving closer without consciously deciding to, drawn by an instinct he didn't fully understand, a desire to somehow ease the burden he could see, crushing her beneath its weight. "You don't need to apologize," he said, his voice softer than he'd heard it in years, stripped of the professional polish and carrying something rawer, more genuine. "Your message, it reached me in a way I didn't expect. And when I looked into your situation, when I learned what you've been facing, I knew I had to come here myself, not to judge, not to make you feel small, but because..." He paused, searching for words that would convey what he meant without sounding patronizing or pitying, without reducing her struggle to a feel-good moment for his conscience. "Because sometimes we need to see each other as people, not as statistics or charity cases or distant problems. And I wanted to meet the woman who had the courage to ask for help, who's been fighting so hard to take care of her son, even when everything seems impossible." Something shifted in the air between them, a subtle change in the quality of the space they occupied together, as if his words had opened a door neither of them had known was there. Emma looked at him with those luminous dark eyes, really looked at him for the first time, and Alexander felt the weight of her gaze in a way that made him acutely aware of himself, not as a CEO or a wealthy benefactor, but as simply a man standing in front of a woman who had touched something he'd thought was unreachable. He saw her take in his face, his expression, searching for signs of condescension or pity, and finding instead something that seemed to surprise her. Genuine respect, honest concern, and beneath that, flickering like candlelight in a dark room, the beginning of something neither of them was ready to name, but both could feel emerging in the charged quiet between them. "Why?" she asked finally, the single word carrying a universe of unspoken questions. "Why care? Why come here? Why look at me like that? Like I'm not just a problem to be solved, but a person worth knowing?" Alexander smiled then, a real smile that felt unfamiliar on his face, that cracked through years of practiced neutrality and revealed something warmer underneath. "Because I remember what it's like," he said simply. And in those 6 words, he offered her something he rarely gave anyone, a glimpse of his own vulnerability, his own past, the boy he'd been before success had built walls around him. "I grew up in a place not too different from this. My mother struggled the way you're struggling. And I remember thinking that someday, if I ever had the power to help someone in that situation, I would. Not from a distance, not through systems and donations, but as one human being reaching out to another." He paused, letting the honesty of it settle between them. "Your message reminded me of that promise. And more than that, It reminded me that having everything I thought I wanted doesn't mean much if I've lost the ability to connect with the things that actually matter. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the autumn light filtering through the single window and painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Ethan playing quietly in the background with his toy cars, the sounds of the building settling around them like a protective shell. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. Something subtle and profound. Something that couldn't be quantified or explained in rational terms. Two people from completely different worlds, separated by every circumstance except the fundamental ones of loneliness and longing, and the deep human need to be seen, truly seen, recognized each other across that distance. Emma saw not just wealth and power, but a man who carried his own scars, his own memories of struggle, his own hunger for connection that success hadn't managed to satisfy. And Alexander saw not just poverty and need, but strength and grace, and a kind of beauty that had nothing to do with appearance, and everything to do with the luminous quality of someone who refuses to let hardship extinguish their light. Neither of them could have articulated what was happening. Neither would have been comfortable naming the electricity that hummed quietly in the space between them. But both felt it. The unmistakable sense that this meeting was not just about helping or being helped, but about two souls recognizing something essential in each other, something that whispered of possibility, of futures neither had imagined, of a connection that was already beginning to take root in the fertile ground of shared understanding and mutual respect. "Let me help you," Alexander said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever delicate thing was forming between them. "Not because I pity you. Not because I'm trying to ease my conscience or check a box on some charitable giving list, but because I think..." He paused, surprising himself with what he was about to say, with how true it felt, even though it was completely unlike him to be this honest, this vulnerable. "Because I think maybe you're helping me too, in ways I'm only beginning to understand. And because everyone deserves to have someone in their corner, someone who sees their struggle and says, 'I'm here. You're not alone. Let me stand with you.'" Emma's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they spilled over, tracking down her cheeks in silent acknowledgement of words that had reached past her defenses and touched the aching loneliness she'd been carrying for so long. And as Alexander reached out, offering her a handkerchief from his pocket in a gesture so simple and so kind it nearly broke her, they both understood that something had shifted irrevocably, that this encounter had become the beginning of something neither could control or predict, a connection that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves, about love, about the distance between two worlds and the bridges that could span it if two hearts were brave enough to reach. The days that followed that first meeting unfolded like pages, turning in a book neither of them had chosen to read but couldn't put down, each chapter revealing something new, something unexpected, something that shifted the ground beneath their feet in ways both terrifying and exhilarating. Alexander had left Emma's apartment that evening with a promise that felt more like a vow, his mind already working through not just how to help, but how to do it in a way that honored her dignity, that gave her agency rather than reducing her to a passive recipient of charity. He couldn't stop thinking about the conversation they'd had, the way her voice had wavered between pride and desperation, the fierce love he'd witnessed in every gesture toward her son, and more than that, the inexplicable pull he'd felt standing in that cramped apartment, as if something in him recognized something in her, as if their meeting had been less coincidence and more inevitability, two puzzle pieces that didn't know they were missing each other until they clicked into place. The first thing he did was practical, immediate, the kind of help that couldn't wait for bureaucracy or perfect plans. Within 24 hours, Emma's refrigerator was fully stocked, her electricity bill paid for the next 6 months, her rent secured through a foundation Alexander controlled but didn't attach his name to, wanting her to accept it without the weight of personal obligation crushing her ability to simply receive. But he knew, even as he authorized these payments, that money alone wasn't what she needed, wasn't what would truly change the trajectory of her life. Emma Chen wasn't someone who wanted handouts. That had been clear in every line of her body, in the way she'd struggled to accept even this initial help. Her pride and her desperation locked in a battle that made his heart ache with recognition. What she needed was opportunity, the chance to stand on her own feet again, to reclaim the identity that poverty had been slowly stripping away. And as Alexander sat in his office late one night, scrolling through her portfolio that she'd hesitantly shared after he'd asked, he realized with growing excitement that he didn't just want to help her. He wanted to work with her, to bring her into his world not as a charity case, but as the talented designer she'd been before circumstances had derailed her path. The conversation about the job offer happened 3 days later, in a coffee shop halfway between their two worlds, a neutral space where neither felt the full weight of their difference. Alexander had rehearsed what he wanted to say, wanting to present it not as rescue, but as opportunity, as a legitimate offer based on merit, rather than pity. "Your work is exceptional," he told her, his laptop open between them showing her designs. Vibrant, creative, full of the kind of fresh perspective his marketing department desperately needed. "Our company is expanding into a new market segment, and we need someone who can think outside the conventional corporate aesthetic. Someone with your eye for color, for emotion, for telling stories through visual language." He watched her face as he spoke, saw the play of emotions across her features, disbelief warring with hope, suspicion that this was charity dressed up as opportunity battling against the desperate desire to believe it might be real. "This isn't about what happened," he added quietly, leaning forward so she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "This is about what I see in your work. You're talented, Emma. Really talented. And I need talent more than I need to feel good about myself." Emma had stared at him for a long moment, her coffee cup cradled between her hands as if its warmth were the only thing anchoring her to reality. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the coffee shop. "Not just the food and the rent. I'm grateful for that, more grateful than I can express. But this, offering me a job in your company, bringing me into your world. Why?" It was a fair question, one Alexander had been asking himself in the quiet hours when honesty was unavoidable. The truth was complicated, layered with motivations he was only beginning to understand. Part of it was genuine recognition of her talent, a business decision that made sense regardless of their circumstances. Part of it was the memory of his own mother, the way opportunity had been denied to her, not because she lacked ability, but because she lacked access, and his deep desire to be for Emma what no one had been for the woman who raised him. But beneath both of those reasons, humming quietly like an undertone, neither of them was ready to acknowledge, was something else entirely. The simple, profound fact that he wanted to see her again, wanted to be in her presence, wanted to watch her rediscover herself as the weight of survival lifted enough for her spirit to unfold again. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," Alexander said finally, the words feeling inadequate, but true. "And because I think you could bring something to my company that we're missing, a perspective, a warmth, a humanity that gets lost when you spend too much time in boardrooms and forget what real life looks like." He paused, then added with a slight smile that softened his usually serious expression. "And maybe because I'm tired of being surrounded by people who only tell me what I want to hear. You're real, Emma. You don't perform or pretend. And that's rarer than you might think." She had accepted, her hands shaking slightly as they shook on it, sealing an agreement that felt like more than just employment, more than just a transaction between employer and employee. It felt like a crossing of thresholds, a stepping into unknown territory where the rules weren't clear, and the boundaries between professional and personal were already blurring in ways neither of them was quite prepared to navigate. The weeks that followed transformed both their lives in ways subtle and profound, like watching a time lapse of seasons changing, of ice melting into flowing water, of closed buds opening into bloom. Emma started working from a small office near the design department. Her presence there initially met with curiosity, and then quickly earning respect as her work spoke for itself. Campaigns that resonated emotionally, designs that captured something authentic and human that the company's previous aesthetic had been missing. Alexander found excuses to stop by her office more often than strictly necessary, ostensibly to check on projects, but really just to see her, to watch the way confidence slowly returned to her movements, to hear her laugh when something amused her, to witness the gradual transformation as security gave her space to breathe, to create, to remember who she'd been before survival had consumed everything. They fell into a rhythm of coffee meetings that evolved into working lunches that stretched into evening conversations where work became secondary to the simple pleasure of talking, of discovering each other's stories, of finding unexpected common ground between their vastly different experiences. Ethan thrived too, enrolled in a daycare program that Emma could now afford, his world expanding in ways that brought tears to his mother's eyes when she picked him up and found him laughing with friends, his small belly full, his future suddenly less precarious. Alexander met him properly on a Saturday afternoon, when Emma brought him to the office to show him where Mama worked, and found himself unexpectedly charmed by the boy's serious questions and bright laughter, by the way he looked at his mother with absolute trust and adoration. "Are you Mama's friend?" Ethan asked him directly, with the straightforward honesty of children who haven't learned to hide behind social niceties. And Alexander had found himself crouching down to the boy's level, meeting those amber eyes that were so much like Emma's, and answering with an honesty that surprised him. "I hope so," he said. "Your Mama is pretty special." And when he looked up and caught Emma's expression, something soft and wondering and cautiously hopeful, he felt his heart do something it hadn't done in years, maybe ever, a kind of free fall that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The moment everything changed happened on an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind of moment that arrives without announcement, without dramatic music or warning signs, just a quiet shift that rearranges everything. They had been working late on a presentation, the office empty around them, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows like scattered stars. Emma had been leaning over his desk pointing at something on his laptop screen, close enough that he could smell her shampoo, something simple and floral that somehow seemed more intoxicating than any expensive perfume. When she turned her head and found his face closer than she'd realized, their eyes meeting with an intensity that made the air between them feel suddenly electric, charged with everything they'd been carefully not acknowledging. For a heartbeat, maybe two, they simply looked at each other, and in that suspended moment, Alexander saw his entire carefully constructed life stretching out behind him, all those years of control and distance and emotional safety, and realized with crystalline clarity that he didn't want safe anymore, didn't want distant, didn't want the hollow success of a life that protected him from feeling anything deeply. He wanted this woman with her quiet strength and luminous spirit, this unexpected connection that had cracked open his carefully sealed heart and let light pour in. "Emma," he said softly, her name on his lips feeling like both a question and an answer, and he saw in her eyes that she understood, that she felt it too. This pull, this recognition, this sense that something profound was happening between them that had started as charity and circumstance, but had transformed into something neither could define, but both could feel growing stronger with each passing day. She didn't pull away, didn't retreat into the safety of professional distance. Instead, she reached up slowly, hesitantly, and touched his face with a gentleness that made his breath catch, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, as if memorizing it, as if confirming that this was real, that he was real, that this impossible thing blooming between them wasn't just her imagination or desperate hope, but something mutual, something shared. "I never expected you," she whispered. And the vulnerability in her voice, the truth of it, broke something open in Alexander that had been locked away for so long he'd forgotten it existed. The ability to be seen, truly seen, not as a CEO or a benefactor or a success story, but as simply a man, flawed and lonely and aching for connection, standing in front of a woman who had somehow, impossibly, become essential to his breathing. The kiss, when it finally happened, was tender and careful. A question being asked and answered simultaneously, neither rushing nor hesitant but present, real. full of all the emotion they'd been holding back and could no longer contain. And when they finally pulled apart, breathing slightly faster, eyes wide with the realization of what they'd just acknowledged, Alexander found himself smiling, truly smiling, in a way he couldn't remember doing in years. "This is probably complicated," Emma said, a laugh bubbling up that was half nerves and half pure joy. And Alexander laughed too, pulling her closer, resting his forehead against hers in a gesture of such intimate tenderness it made his chest ache. "Probably," he agreed. "Different worlds, different lives. Everyone will have opinions about how this looks, about whether it's appropriate or wise or any of 1,000 other rational objections." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, wanting her to see the certainty in his, wanting her to understand that what he was about to say came from the deepest truth he knew. "But I don't care. I've spent my whole life making the rational choice, the safe choice, building walls so high nothing could reach me. And then you sent that message, and somehow you reached me anyway. You reminded me what it feels like to be human, to care about something more than profit margins and market shares. You made me want to be better, not because you asked me to, but because seeing your strength, your grace, your refusal to let hardship break you, it showed me what real strength looks like." They stood there in the quiet office, the city spread out below them like a carpet of light. Two people who had started as strangers, separated by every circumstance, but united by something more fundamental. A recognition of souls. A meeting that felt less like chance and more like destiny, whispering its intentions in a language older than words. The journey from that desperate message to this moment had been improbable, unlikely, the kind of story people might doubt if told secondhand, because it seemed too perfect, too much like a fairy tale. But fairy tales, Alexander thought as he held Emma close and felt her heartbeat against his chest, were just stories about transformation, about walls coming down and hearts opening up, about two people finding each other across impossible distances and choosing, despite all logic and reason, to reach for each other anyway. And that was exactly what they were doing. Reaching, choosing, beginning something that would require courage and vulnerability, and a willingness to believe that sometimes, in a world that often felt cold and indifferent, love could still emerge from the most unexpected places, could still transform lives, could still prove that the distance between two hearts is nothing compared to the power of two hands reaching toward each other across the dark. "So what happens now?" Emma asked, her voice soft but steady, and Alexander felt something warm and solid settle in his chest, a sense of rightness that had been missing from his life for longer than he cared to admit. "Now," he said, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that felt like a promise, "we figure it out together. One day at a time, one moment at a time, your world and mine, until there's just our world, built on honesty and respect and whatever this is between us that I can't name but can't deny." He smiled, pulling back to look at her, to memorize this moment when everything changed, when lonely became together, when separate became unified. "I don't have all the answers, Emma, but I know that meeting you was the best thing that's happened to me in longer than I can remember. And I know that whatever comes next, I want to face it with you beside me. Not behind me, not beneath me, but beside me, as equals, as partners, as whatever we decide to become." And in the warm glow of that evening, with possibilities spreading out before them like roads waiting to be traveled, Alexander Hayes and Emma Chen stood together at the beginning of their story. No longer a wealthy CEO and a struggling mother, no longer separated by circumstance or distance, but simply two people who had found each other in the most unexpected way, and discovered that sometimes the greatest wealth has nothing to do with money, and everything to do with the courage to open your heart and let someone in. The message that had started everything still existed somewhere in digital space, those 12 words that had bridged worlds and changed lives. "My son is without milk. I have nowhere left to turn." But now they could read it differently, could see it not as an ending, but as a beginning, not as desperation, but as destiny disguised as need, not as a plea for help, but as the first words of a love story neither had been looking for, but both had been needing all along.